I'm Paul Perrello, and welcome to the Philly Factor. Well, it's that time of year when people's thoughts sort of turn outdoors. We live in Philadelphia, where everyone is anxious to get outside of their row homes. They want to get out and start to, perhaps totter around in their gardens. Well, we have a great program lined up for you here because, especially in the Philadelphia area, how often we may have passed an area and noticed a person's backyard garden or maybe their front lawn and say, gee, I wonder if I can do that. Well, gardening for some people, a passion, it's a lifestyle. And in the greater Philadelphia area, there are a number of gardens that are actually tourist attractions. We're going to be talking about a new book that is out, A Guide to the Great Gardens of the Philadelphia Region. Adam Levine is an award-winning garden writer whose work has appeared in many regional and national magazines. Adam is also co-author of The Passion for Gardening and the Philadelphia Flower Show. Joining Adam is Rob Cardillo, a Philadelphia-based garden photographer, formerly the director of photography at Organic Gardening magazine. His work now appears in Garden Design, Horticulture, Better Homes and Gardens, and many other magazines. And guys, I'd like to welcome you to the program. Thanks for being with us on the Philly Factor.
Thank you.
This book is a wonderful book. I mean, it's a great resource, and we're going to get into what the book really is all about. But I think, now that the weather is nice and it's warm, and there are people that will start to, play around with their gardens. But by any stretch of the imagination, playing around is probably the wrong word to use when we see some of the great gardens that you've sort of highlighted in this book, Adam.
Yeah, actually, a lot of the gardeners do have fun doing what they're doing, but we do have some of the greatest gardens in the region, in the entire country, in this region. And it's probably, I call it in the book, the epicenter of horticulture in the United States. Like an earthquake has its epicenter, horticulture is sort of started here back in William Penn's time.
I was going to ask that because, much of what we see in the city of Philadelphia, I mean, there are certain areas, especially in the city, that have been designated and set aside as nothing but like parks, if you will. And it really does go back to William Penn when he established the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and laid out the city of Philadelphia, and some of the nicest parks and the nicest, I actually call Rittenhouse Square a garden in itself, and Logan Square has just been renovated, and then you have other garden areas in Center City as well.
Mm-hmm. So how did you, Rob, decide that you had a book then, that you were going to highlight the great gardens of the Philadelphia region?
Well, about 4 years ago, both Adam and I are transplants to this area. We both grew up in different areas and moved to Philadelphia as young men, and we both, I discovered a number of gardens on my own, and the more I discovered some, the more I wanted to know where others might be. And I thought a guidebook would be an appropriate thing to have. There was no real other guide. There were a few other guides, but nothing that really sort of could give you an unbiased and thorough view of a lot of our treasures. Mm-hmm. So I approached Temple Press, and along with Adam, and we finally, I think, produced a book that's worthy of the gardens in our region.
How did you set out to find these gardens? I mean, is there a resource where you can go? Do you go to the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society and say, we're looking for some great gardens that we can feature in this book? I mean, how do you start the research? Because everybody thinks that they probably have the best garden in their neighborhood, or a community group may feel that they have the best garden. So how do you start taking on this task?
Well, there had been a book written before us about 12 years ago, and so we used that as a basis, and basically checked out all the gardens that were in that book, and some of them weren't really gardens, it turned out, so we sort of weeded it out that way. Then we did go to the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society and all the other gardeners that Rob and I know through our contacts throughout the area, and we asked everybody, what would you recommend? We don't want to miss anything. So we just basically put word out, through emails and phone calls, and everybody we talked to while we were compiling the list, we just asked everybody, what should be in this book. We described the region to them, which is from about Trenton, New Jersey, down to Newark, Delaware, the University of Delaware. So you gave them some limitations, and we came up with a list, and then it was up to Rob and I to decide how to present the gardens, because other books haven't really. How would I put it? How should I put it, Rob?
Well, it took a lot of research. I think we really we spent a lot of time not only compiling the list of possible gardens, but then we went to visit each one of these gardens more than once to make sure that there was certain consistency between visits and to experience different seasons in the different gardens. And that took a considerable amount of time and a lot of car mileage as we're driving from Grounds for Sculpture, a wonderful sculpture garden up near Trenton, New Jersey, all the way down to Newcastle, Delaware, where some of our most southern gardens are listed.
Most people would think that, well, you know, if you're going to look at these gardens to include in the book, are you only looking at the gardens then in sort of the warmer months, you know, like spring and summer? Or are you visiting, I guess, like a place like Longwood Gardens, you probably could visit in the fall and the winter because there's always something going on at Longwood Gardens. So, I mean, so was this a 365-day passion to make sure you sort of did all your homework and did all your research before you actually put it in a book?
Well, we did try to look at the gardens, as you were saying, when they were looking their best, and some of them don't really have a winter season. They don't have 4 acres under glass like Longwood Gardens does. So we tried to see them when they were at their best, and if they didn't look good when we saw them the first time, we tried to see them again. But it was a 365-day obsession with us when we were putting this together, because we were worried about leaving things out, we were worried about missing things, and then we were worried about emphasizing certain gardens that might not be as interesting as others, giving them undue emphasis. So we really tried to rank the gardens in the book from those that we thought were the most interesting and had the most to offer to those of the lesser interest. And I think we did a really good job, and that's never been done before with a garden guidebook in this area. I mean, actually, there's never been a book like this done before. So.
Again, it's called A Guide to the Great Gardens of the Philadelphia Region. It is a wonderful resource. Not only does it tell you where the gardens are located, there are some great pictures in there, thanks to Rob Cardillo, to sort of capture the essence of not the gardens, you know, generally, but even some of the plants and the shrubs and the flowers that you might see at one garden in the Philadelphia area, and you might not necessarily see anywhere else in the area.
Right. I did try to make sure that any of the photographs, any of the close-ups of flowers or leaves or specific plants would relate to that garden, or would be characteristic of that particular garden within the book. I wanted to make sure that all my photographs had a real sense of place, so that each one of them, even if it's a detail or a bit of architectural detail, that it would actually resonate and let people know that this was from Chanticleer or from Winter Tour.
Did you, when you took on this venture, I mean, did you find that you had more gardens than perhaps you could include in the book? Because, I mean, as you start researching, you know, you might stumble upon something that you didn't know existed, or it's one of those best kept secrets that's out there. So, you know, did you find some gardens that might be worthy for inclusion into the book, but you sort of had to keep them out because you only had so many pages to work with? No,
we managed that. That's the good thing, is through Rob and I negotiating the space, and then negotiating the space with the editor, and then with the designer, and we managed to include just about everything we thought that we knew about at the time that we thought was worthy. Of course, as soon as the book is published, you know, I went out to a friend's office and he showed me a garden that he had done. It was in our area, and so there you go. You know, so. But we actually have, we're hoping to keep the book up to date on our website. That if you want, should I mention that?
Sure, please do.
It's www.phillygardenguide.com, and we were hoping to make that a way to keep the information in the book up to date, and to also include new gardens. And I've also found several other ones that people have told me about. You know, everybody who picks up the book says, well, you know, it's like you were saying, I have my favorite in my area, and maybe you should put it in the next edition.
Sure. Let's talk a little bit about these gardens and just how accessible they might be for people to visit. I mean, it's great to have a resource like this, but people, you know, and you provide great directions, great locations for people to find these gardens, but how accessible are they for the public? I mean, if someone wants to visit like Longwood Gardens, I mean, you know, that sort of tends to be a tourist attraction, so easy to find, it's easy to get to, you pay the admission and go in. But some of the other gardens, they may not be on the, on the straight and narrow path, they may be off on a secondary roadway or whatever. So just how accessible are they to the public? I mean, are they inviting to the public? If you sort of get the book and sort of find where they are you gonna be welcomed if you show up at the front gate?
Well, the gardens are open in various ways. When we say public garden, we mean that it's open to the public. Some of them are open for free, like the Jenkins Arboretum in Devon. It's a beautiful little arboretum. It's open from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. every day of the year, and you don't have to pay. You can just park your car and walk in. Others are only open by appointment, and some of them you actually have to have a group together, and can be fairly expensive. But those are some of the newer gardens, and we're hoping that over time some of them become a little bit more accessible. And we wanted to encourage them in some ways to become a little bit more open, to open more widely by putting them in the book. And we also thought that some of those gardens by appointment only are some of the most little known and some of the most beautiful gardens in the area.
Sure. What has been the reaction of, I guess, these gardens, these locations, to be included in this book? Because they may have been sort of like, inconsequential up until a certain, point. Now all of a sudden the attention of the book, it's great if people are, showing up and they're touring the gardens. B, all of a sudden these gardens that, were relatively unknown now have all this attention on them. What has been the reaction then of these gardens that have been highlighted in the book?
Well, surprisingly, very positively. We've talked to a number of the directors or people that run these gardens, and they've been delighted to be included and to be showcased. And a lot of them had been sort of eclipsed by some of the bigger gardens in our region for so long that nobody ever really paid much attention to their little corner of the horticultural universe. And we've been very happy to shine some light on some of these lesser known places. When
you're out talking about this book, everybody probably has their best story or their best location, and they want to share it with you. And I think the internet is a great way for people to keep up with all of the information that's out there. And they can also actually order the book online at phillygardenguide.com. Again, the name of the book is A Guide to the Great Gardens of the Philadelphia Region. You can find more information about the authors as well as the book at that location. And also Rob, who is a photographer, his website is robcardillo.com if you would like more information about the photography that you're going to see in the book and some of the other things that Rob is involved in. What makes for a great garden then? I mean, everybody thinks they probably have a great garden, but
Sure.
What makes for a great garden? Is it that little windowsill garden that I have growing in my, townhouse in Society Hill? That makes for a great garden for me.
Well, do you want to take that, Adam? Go ahead.
Oh, well, what I tell people, sometimes people come to see my garden and they say, oh, well, your garden is so much better than mine. And I tell them, if your garden gives you pleasure, then that's what it has to do. It has to give you pleasure. The great gardens give us a great amount of pleasure.
Sure.
I mean, but not. It's a guide to the great gardens, but not every garden in here is a great big, garden that's going to take you all day to see. Some of them you can visit in an hour. But some of the things that make a great garden in my mind are just the plants they use and the combinations and the colors and then the architecture of the garden, either the buildings around it or the way it's laid out, and what are some of the other things?
Well, there's a real diversity of gardens here too. We have sculpture gardens in here. One, Grounds for Sculpture, which I mentioned earlier, is a fabulous combination of modern art and interesting landscaping. Other gardens, such as community gardens, many people might not think they're great until you go there and talk to the gardeners, and you realize how much spirit there is and how much these gardens mean to neighborhoods and to groups of people. So the word "great," I think we're being very ecumenical here.
Sure, absolutely. You mentioned the gardeners that work in these gardens, and which brings me to my next area of questioning is that who's responsible for these these great pieces of gardening that are out there, and whether it's in Trenton, whether it's in Delaware, whether it's in Center City, Philadelphia. I mean, are volunteers mainly responsible in some cases for maintaining the grounds? Are we talking about some gardens that have, staff people, paid staffers that, make sure that the gardens are at their best looking possible way each and every day?
It ranges from Longwood Gardens, which has a staff in the hundreds, numbering in the hundreds, especially during the peak season, during the growing season from spring to fall, to small gardens that are mainly relying on volunteers and in some ways struggling because of that. A lot of the larger gardens also use volunteers to help maintain them. The Scott Arboretum at Swarthmore College has a whole associates program where they have hundreds of people who will come to classes and to learn before they're even allowed to pull a weed on the grounds. And some of the I'd say one of the best gardens in the country right now is Chanticleer, and they have a rather small staff considering the level of horticulture, but they have a very dedicated staff of probably some of the most talented horticultural people in the region. So there's a whole range and combinations of staffing and volunteers and that helps keep them looking good.
Do you find many community groups involved with perhaps some of the gardens that are in their neighborhoods? Because oftentimes it's a volunteer effort, it's a community group that maintains the grounds of some of these gardens.
Well, in the parks, a lot of the parks in Center City have volunteer groups. The Friends of Rittenhouse Square, the Azalea Garden by the Art Museum some of them are organized through the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, which helps funnel volunteers to these places. Also, the community gardens are almost, I'd say, exclusively volunteers, and there are hundreds of those. Philadelphia was one of the pioneers in community gardening in the country and continues to be a role model for cities all over the United States as far as that goes.
Yeah, it is pretty remarkable that given the urban setting that we have in Philadelphia, that you can make a turn on a street and all of a sudden there's this patch of green, there's a garden there, and you sort of are taken aback because you don't necessarily expect to see that as you're driving up Broad Street or driving down Market Street or wherever you're driving, and you make a turn and then there's this park, there's this garden that is maintained by a great community group organization. And that's what I think is, sort of adds to the charm of the city. And I think it goes back to what, William Penn, his original intention was for the city of Philadelphia and the Commonwealth back in the 1600s, I guess, when he established the Commonwealth. People will look at your book and they'll say, gee, I wish I could do that in my community garden, or I wish I could do that in my backyard in some cases. Are these gardens in the Philadelphia area, are the people there prepared, or can they help people? For instance, if I walk through, one of the gardens featured in the book, and there's something that I might see, and I wonder if I could, perhaps, try to grow this in my, my front lawn or my backyard. I mean, are these groups able to assist people with some of their gardening ideas?
Well, I think that's one of the benefits of visiting public gardens and other people's gardens in general, is that you can learn to be a better gardener by visiting these places. You can talk to other gardeners who are more experienced than you are. You can see a selection of plants, a whole palette of horticultural material that might work in this region and how it's combined. It's a tricky thing to become a good gardener. I think it takes a lot of talent and experience, but you can accelerate your own development as a gardener by visiting good public displays of horticulture.
Yeah, I call the book a how-to book in that way, because what better way to learn how to garden better than to go to some of these great gardens. Mm-hmm. And especially at some of them, the staff is very accessible, and you can talk to them, and they actually enjoy talking to people and sharing what they know and hearing. It's a back and forth for them.
Sure. Would the two of you agree that there's more interest in gardening today than perhaps 10 or maybe even 20 years ago, especially in an urban environment. And, I sort of alluded to the windowsill garden. I mean, because in some cases, all you have to do is drive down the Schuylkill Expressway and see some of the high-rise apartment buildings, and you can look up and you can see that, people will have like pots, hanging from their balcony, and they have thriving plants, that are there. So it seems to me that people are, they may not have a great garden like featured in the book, but people are interested in gardening. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I think there's a real need to connect to the green world. It becomes more difficult as there's less of it.
Sure.
And in some of these places become really important, and our own gardens become very important, not just for the pleasure they give us, but they also in some ways support wildlife, butterflies, migrating birds. So we can plug into the bigger world, the bigger green world, in our own gardens, and I definitely think there's been a lot more attention paid to that now.
Adam, you would agree?
Yeah, I think especially in this area where we have we have a 300+ year history of horticulture or an ornamental horticulture. I think that, and there's so many opportunities for people, especially for learning through various institutions. I think there's a great interest. It seems too like the closer you get to one of these some of the greatest of the great gardens, certain neighborhoods around them tend to benefit from that.
Sure.
That's true. Swarthmore in particular, I think.
The borough of Swarthmore, the horticultural level of that little community is affected by the Scott Arboretum at Swarthmore College, which is 300 acres of beautiful horticulture. So.
Yeah, I want to go back to and also ask a question, because you sort of take for granted that, many of the trees and some of the plants that are in these gardens just weren't planted there yesterday. In your research for your book, were you able to highlight maybe some of the growth, some of the trees that may be, sort of historic? Because when you talk about Philadelphia, it's sort of synonymous with history, and you could go down to 6th and Market and see the Liberty Bell and see Independence Hall, and we sort of, perhaps not in a negative way, take it for granted because it's always been there. But you could pass a park and may not realize that the tree that's in that park or that garden may be perhaps as old as the roots of the foundation of this country.
Well, there's actually a website, and I'll give this, the guy named Scott Way, www.pabigtrees.com, and we actually use that website to try to establish where some of the bigger trees in some of these gardens were. And there are some of the oldest trees in Pennsylvania, and some of them are actually the oldest trees in the country in some of these gardens. Huge, beautiful specimens that are you don't see many other places, especially off the East Coast. And like a little garden named Rockwood in Delaware has some huge, beautiful specimens that we have some pictures of in the book. And Hagley Museum has some of the largest trees in the country of their type, and the Tyler Arboretum, and that's one of my favorite things. And we were going to try to make a special feature in the book for champion trees, which is what they're called, but we just for that kind of feature we sort of did run out of space.
Sure. Yeah. Photographing these gardens, we talked about a little bit in our first segment. You want to sort of capture the essence. You want to capture the feel of the garden and sort of serve as a postcard, if you will, of what the garden is, so people can sort of take a look at it and say, yeah, that is a place that I would like to, that I would like to visit. And with the whole revolution now that's underway with photography, if you went out and and shot a photo of a plant or a tree or a shrub, you as a photographer, Rob, did you find yourself sort of challenged to sort of capture the essence of some of the stuff that you were looking at?
Well, sure. It's always a challenge to make a really good photograph. Some of these gardens are just so impeccably maintained and so rich with so many textures and colors that it's very easy to make dramatic photographs. I'd say Chanticleer being one of them. Mm-hmm. But other gardens are a little more quiet and are a little bit harder to translate into something that's going to be a good, strong photograph and something that's characteristic of that place. The cover had a funny story on it. This cover,
Sure.
because of we were frustrated. We couldn't find quite the right cover until this was shot the day before the book had to actually go to press in Italy. And this image was done digitally, which meant we could see it, review it, send it around to all the folks who needed to see it, be accepted as the cover. It also has a funny story behind it too, is the fact that this particular frame was taken just a few minutes after a crowd of 20 people walked through that picture. And I have a series of those pictures too, which is very funny. But the revolution in digital photography made this cover possible.
You know, you look at the cover of this and you say, you know, it's impossible. This can't be Philadelphia. I mean, when you look at the oranges and the pinks and the blues and the greens and the purples, it's sort of like, you know, and then to hear that 20 people had just walked by, you know, right before you took or right after the picture or right before the picture. It's amazing. Able to capture, you know, this picture like this.
Well, it was a challenge. I'd been to Chanticleer many times. I'd never saw this particular combination from this particular angle, and it is a palette of plants that we don't normally associate with this region. Many of these are tropicals or tenders that need to be dug up and brought indoors for the winter. But instead of a traditional formal garden that people might think is something that they would identify with Philadelphia, we thought maybe something a little bit different would be more interesting.
Catches my attention, and I'm sure if it's sitting on a bookcase somewhere on a bookshelf in a bookstore, it's going to catch people's attentions for sure.
And we want it sitting on everybody's coffee table too.
Absolutely.
And their mothers too.
And that's why you can, it is available in bookstores right now, and again, you could go to phillygardenguide.com for more information about purchasing the book. In the 2 minutes that we have left, quickly here, what was the biggest thing that you were startled by when you decided to do this book? Of all the gardens that you traveled to, that you visited, what was the thing that sort of like, you know, struck you as, wow, I didn't know that? The wow factor they refer to.
Well, there was one, I mentioned the Jenkins Arboretum earlier, and that was probably the most exciting new discovery for me. It's been there since 1976, but I had never been there. Another one, maybe you want to talk about Nemours.
Oh, Nemours it's a classical DuPont, large French-inspired garden that has been closed for 2 years for renovation, and it's going to open sometime in 2008, and it's going to be phenomenal. We saw it in its unfinished stages, and it was funny because Adam called me from the site. He was there originally. And he was very excited about it, and he said, "You have to get down here right away."
And then when Rob went, he called me on the cell phone and said, "I can't believe this, that I've never been here before." Yeah. But a lot of people have never been there before, so that would be one that I would really recommend people to book their reservations for, because that one will be by appointment only.
Well, it's all in the book, A Guide to the Great Gardens of the Philadelphia Region, and I can't thank my guests enough for being with us here on the Philly Factor and sharing their great work with us both during our show and again in this great resource, A Guide to the Great Gardens of the Philadelphia Region. My thanks to Adam Levine and Rob Cardillo, the authors of the book, for being with us here on the Philly Factor. Until the next time, for the Philly Factor, thanks so much for being with us. I'm Paul Perrello. And we just sit there.